This is going to be a full build video for building this 5-inch freestyle drone. For this build, I'm going to be using the DJI O4 Lite with the flywheel wide angle lens, the Zex FPV Athena flight controller, and 80 amp ESC. The motors are going to be Mepsking 2207, 1950 kV, and it's going to be on the Demibot frame with the Gemfan Hurricane props. This frame supports multiple mounting patterns, so be sure you pick the one that matches your flight controller. Push the insert into the frame and then tighten the screw from the opposite side. This will pull the insert into place. I'm going to install the motors and the ESC onto the frame. That way I could measure out the length of the wires and cut them accordingly. For soldering like this, you either want to use a chisel tip or a bevel tip. That'll give you a good thermal conductivity. Try to avoid using the smaller pointy tips since those are usually for smaller components like capacitors or resistors. Now let's prep the XT60. One thing I like to do is I'll connect two connectors together, and that'll keep everything aligned while I'm soldering it, since sometimes the pins can shift around from the heat. Add some flux, tin the connector, and then tin the wire. Be sure not to use too much solder or you'll have a hard time aligning both parts together. Once the soldering for the connector is done, you can just put on the little shield for it. Now let's tin all the pads on the ESC. Add some flux and put a small amount of solder on all of the pads. You could always add more solder later. Now you can start soldering on the wires. After getting everything soldered down, we're going to fast forward about a week where I took the drone out for about 30 test flights and I crashed a bunch of times. One of the last few crashes was onto concrete and then I ended up damaging one of the motors. Thankfully, Mepsking sent over a replacement motor. These motors held up pretty well for lighter crashes into trees and, softer objects, but once I started crashing into concrete, then one of the screws stripped out and that caused the motor to just detach, and I wasn't able to screw it down properly anymore. But the motor wasn't the only issue. I also noticed damage starting to form on some of the wires going into the ESC. This is my own fault for soldering the wires straight on. Normally I solder them straight on, and that works for my smaller drones, but this isn't good for a 5-inch. The layout on the left is a common method that people use, but this method is a bit controversial. Some people do it and have no issues, but there's also a lot of claims that it can cause electromagnetic interference since you're running wires straight across the ESC and the flight controller. The layout on the right is from my Seeker 3. The wires are routed straight on top of each other. I tried replicating this for the 5-inch setup, but the motor wires are actually a bit stiffer and I had a hard time doing this. So I ended up going with a third option by just routing the wires at a 45-degree angle. Some ESCs are designed for this, but mine wasn't, so I just had to eyeball it and align them manually. I also decided to reposition the capacitor. Originally it was rubbing against the MIPI cable, which wasn't good for the long term. Now we're going to install a longer MIPI cable for the DJI O4 Lite. The stock cable isn't long enough for this setup. I'm going to use a hot air rework station to soften up the adhesive around the connector. Use some tweezers to carefully lift up the locking tabs and remove the connector. When installing the new cable, be sure to double check the alignment before pressing it down. There are some tiny notches on the connector that help line up everything correctly. The camera side is a bit trickier since it connects through an adapter board instead of plugging directly into the camera. But the process is the same as before. Just be sure not to overheat the camera housing since it is plastic. Before gluing everything down, I wanted to test the camera to make sure everything works. You could just plug it into a flight controller and then plug in the battery and then do a quick test with your goggles. This adhesive isn't quite as strong as the factory adhesive that DJI uses, so I do use significantly more to help make sure that the connector doesn't ever come loose. The TPU assembly holds the air unit, the antenna, the power connector, and the capacitor all in one piece. I originally planned to use the Flywoo CNC cooling kit for protection, but after thinking about it, I realized TPU would be better at absorbing impacts. I also noticed that the motor wires were starting to rub against the frame, so I covered up the sharp edges with some Tesa tape before finally wrapping up the motor wires onto the frame. I also designed these horns for the front of the drone. They aren't just cosmetic, they do help absorb impacts from frontal collisions. It also helps to prevent the battery from getting launched if I crash. The lower jaw also includes a mount for the ELRS receiver. During some of the earlier flights, I actually damaged the balance lead for my battery because I didn't secure it down properly, so I learned my lesson this time, and I secured the battery lead with a rubber band. And I also put it underneath the battery strap. That way it won't get caught in the props anymore. This was my first 5-inch build, and I definitely did make some mistakes along the way, but overall it was a really good learning experience, and I am grateful to Zex FPV and Mepsking for sending me the parts for this build. I also realized that I didn't really cover the software side of setting up this drone. Let me know in the comments if that's something you want to see in a follow-up video, or if you want to know how I designed the TPU parts for this drone. If you enjoyed the video, then please like and subscribe, it really helps the channel. Also, all the parts and tools and the files for this build are linked in the description if you want to build something similar. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.